Contemporary Art, in particular the program of the Royal College of Art in London. And we have Ms. Clare Carolin, who's senior tutor of the said program, to give us a talk.
Okay, so maybe continue a bit better now in the microphone. If I lean backwards and you lose the sound, can you just tell me? I can't hear you because I have a tendency to move around when I'm talking, so this feels very artificial. But take it out. That's better. So I've been asked to come and talk in my capacity as a senior tutor on the Curating Contemporary Art Programme at the Royal College of Art. I've been working on the programme since 2007, and I'm also actually graduated the programme, so I studied with the AA in the late 90s and we graduated together in 1999. And I subsequently worked at the Hayward Gallery in London as exhibitions curator, and left in 2006, and then from 2007 have been working on this programme in various different capacities. I started off working as a visiting lecturer, working with students just on their exhibition projects, and I then, for a period, I was the deputy director and the acting director of the programme, and I'm now working as a senior tutor, which means I have more time to focus on my own projects. And that's kind of crucial because one of the distinguishing features of the CCA programme and also the Royal College is the combination of practice and teaching. So the ethos of the whole college is that all of the people who, and this is not unusual I guess for an art college, but everybody who's teaching there is supposed to have an active practice, and the idea is that their practice will feed into the teaching as much as possible, and also helping creating professional opportunities for the students down the line. So the work that I'm doing here in Manila on the surface of the world is absolutely relevant to what I'm doing with my students, insofar as there are things which will happen here which will feed into my teaching. Can't quite yet maybe tell you what they are, but anyway, so I want to do this very much as a discussion. I don't want to do a formal presentation. I've got a series of slides which relate to the course. They are based around a presentation which was done for a recent open day for students who are potentially interested in joining the course. And obviously, if there's anybody here or if anybody knows anybody who might be interested in studying this course at the Royal College, or indeed any other curatorial course in the UK, I'm happy to talk to them about that specifically. But this isn't intended as a promotional opportunity. It's really just an opportunity to talk about curatorial education, what it has been, what it might be, and what the factors affecting its future might be. And I'm interested in hearing what your thoughts are on those subjects. So I'll just start with describing the course, I guess. The Curating Contemporary Art course was set up in 1992. And it was one of two of the first dedicated master's courses training people to be curators, specifically in contemporary art. I think in the world there was a course that someone called Le Magasin in Grenoble in France, which was set up in 1991. And in 1992, a course was set up in Bard College in New York, more or less concurrently with this course, which was set up at the RCA. And a year later, Goldsmiths College in London was set up as a curatorial course. The distinguishing feature of the RCA course from the beginning was that it was co-funded by the Arts Council of England. The Arts Council of England are basically our Ministry of Culture. So it was it had a sort of very strong, I guess, political mission, and that tied in with a programme of museum and gallery building in the United Kingdom, which was funded through the National Lottery and aimed at creating a cultural infrastructure which would sort of come on stream with the millennium. So this is so from the early 90s onwards, the cultural policymakers in the UK were looking at the cultural infrastructure in the country, deciding that there needed to be more museums and galleries of contemporary art. They had a system for funding the creation of those, and there were lots of new buildings which were created during that period. The most famous of these was Tate Modern, which I'm sure you know of if you haven't visited it. So that was just the most well-known one, but every sort of major regional city in the UK who didn't already have a museum of contemporary art was created during this period. And so the policymakers looked at the kind of black cultural landscape and realised that they didn't have a generation of people who were trained to run these places in all the various different capacities that one needs to administrate, direct, organise exhibitions, run education programmes, fundraise, all of the skill sets that were required for running these museums kind of hadn't been formalised into a single training programme. And so the Curating Contemporary Art Programme, which actually when it started had a different name, it was called Visual Arts Administration, so it was closer to the idea of arts management. It was called Visual Arts Administration, Curating and Commissioning Contemporary Art. So the idea of curating was perhaps secondary to the idea of administration. And as the years went by, the notion of curating and the figure of the curator became more and more potent and current, generally in the culture. That started to take precedence over the idea of visual arts administration, and I think the name change came probably in around 2003 or something. The name of the course changed, although in essence what was being taught on the course didn't change. So there was a sort of perception shift around the difference between visual arts administration and curating. So that was a bit of history. In 2008, the Arts Council ceased to fund the course. So, and the reason for doing so was because, or the logic, the argument for ending that funding agreement was that the generation of curators who they'd set out to train to administrate or curate or run these public spaces in the UK had basically been trained. And the market for the employment market in the public sector at least was saturated, but what had happened in conjunction with that was that the commercial sector in the UK had expanded exponentially. So, and again, the sort of, the obvious symbol of the expansion of the public sector is Tate Modern. The most visible symbolic manifestation of the expansion of the commercial sector is the Frieze Art Fair. So when this course was started in 1992, there was no Frieze Art Fair, there was actually no art fair in London except something which nobody took very seriously. The Frieze Art Fair is now a major event in the visual arts calendar in London, and I think it's fair to say internationally, it's an international brand. There's a Frieze Art Fair in New York now, as well as the London one. And an interesting statistic is that taxi drivers in London make more money during the week of the Frieze Art Fair than any other time during the year, including Christmas and New Year holidays. So that gives you a sense of actually what happens to the city and how the demographic changes and who's in town when the Frieze Art Fair goes on. So rightly so, the Arts Council was saying, we've trained people to run the public sector, the private sector is expanding, the financial emphasis of this has changed, and so the course needs to find other ways to fund itself. And I think their expectation was that there might be wealthy private collectors who would put money into the cause, perhaps fund individual studentships. Also in terms of its sort of international positioning, the course, the emphasis of the course has shifted. So Yaya was one of the minority of international students at the time when she did the course in the 90s. There were quite a few students from Europe because there were very few curatorial courses in Europe. So if you were a European, French, German student, you wanted to study curating in Europe, there were fairly limited options, and the Royal College was one possibility. But what's happened since the course was set up is that the balance of international to local students, if you like, is completely reversed. So we now have more international students on the course than students from the UK, which is a very significant shift, and it's something which, in terms of the teaching provision, I think my view hasn't been fully addressed. So given that our student body is now very international, we need to look very carefully at what we're teaching and how we're teaching it. And these are interesting questions around curatorial education. So just do you want to turn the lights down? This is an image from the most recent exhibition, which was done at the Royal College. It was a show called No One Lives Here, and it was about the effect that the internet and digital technology in general had on visual culture and on I guess on people's lives more broadly. I wasn't actually around when this show happened because I was on a year of leave, so I don't have a great deal of detailed things to say about it, but there is a catalogue for it, and there are a number of the shows that I'm talking about. I've brought catalogues which are on the table over there, and you're welcome to look at them as I'm talking or at the end of the talk. Also, I wanted to say, if there's anything that's not clear or you have something I'm saying provokes a question, to just interrupt me and ask it. There's a microphone here. So as I said, it's more interesting for me. This is more of a discussion and less of a presentation. So do just stop me if you want to ask anything. Can we get to the next slide? So this is just to give you an idea of who the faculty on the course is at the moment. Dr. Victoria Walsh is the head of the programme. She's somebody whose background is in gallery education. She got to Tate Britain prior to joining the course, and she's just been head of programme since the beginning of this year. Prior to that, somebody called Mark Nash, who had curated Documentary 11 with Opry and Weasel, was the head of programme for several years, and before that, someone called Teresa Bledo was the founding head of the programme from 1992, and her background was with the British Council Exhibitions programme. So you get to see, I guess the point is that these people's professional backgrounds were in the public sector curating or institutional positions. I'm a senior tutor. Karen Alexander is someone whose background is actually in film. Focuses on publications and artist books. Michaela Crimmins is a tutor whose focus is on the public domain, so curating in public space. And she also she's currently involved in a research project looking at culture and conflict. So I'll talk a bit more about that later. And Ros Gray is a critical theorist who also has, her background is also related to film histories. And then we have three programme administrators, one of whom is dedicated to working specifically on a research project. So that's an idea of the team Victoria works 3 days a week. I work 5 days a week. Karen works 4 days a week. He works 3 days a week, and Michaela and Ross 1 day a week each. So that gives you a sense of, you know, the kind of distribution of labour. There are the course is 2 years full time. Could you go to the next slide, please? It's a 2-year full-time course, and all the master's courses at the Royal College are 2 years full-time, which is unusual for a master's course. Most masters in the UK are just 1 year. I don't know what the situation is here in the Philippines. It's usually 1 year for a master's.
3 years.
2, okay, this is 1 year. In fact, historically, apparently, the RCA masters used to be 3 and 4 years. But anyway, they're now 2 years. And when I say full-time, the expectation on the students is that they will basically treat the course like a job, like a professional situation. So we expect them to be in college every day of the week except for Fridays, which is a dedicated research day. So there's teaching or some kind of taught activity every day of the week. And in that sense, it differs, I guess, quite significantly from an undergraduate course and also from some of the other MAs, again, in the UK that I'm aware of, which so these are just some sort of general points around the ethos of the programme. As I mentioned before, there's a very strong emphasis on the integration of theory and practice. There's also a very strong emphasis on the need for both collaborative work and individual research, and that affects how the course is structured. So what do I mean by collaboration? Each student cohort consists of around 15 or 16 students, and the expectation from the beginning is that the students will work collaboratively, either in subgroups or in a full group of 15. And that's absolutely a requirement of the course. The students aren't formally assessed in the way they are in a lot of other courses. And again, this is because the teaching model and the assessment model comes from the fact that the original remit of the Royal College of Art was that it was an art and design college, and arts and design are, of course, really quite difficult subjects to assess formally. So moving forwards, they are things that the college is increasingly under pressure to consider as possibilities. So it's quite an idiosyncratic institution. I think that's what I'm saying. But this, I think the advantage of the loose assessment is that it allows people to develop without them. It allows them to develop as individuals without there being a clearly determined set of learning outcomes or criteria that they feel they have to fulfill in order to pass the course. So collaboration and individual research. So what we're looking for when we recruit students is individual people who we believe will have the ability to work in these collaborative situations. But who will also be motivated to work individually. And the reason we do that is because the ethos is that these are both requirements which are absolutely necessary for curators to have as professionals. Curators need to be very, very good collaborators. They need to be able to work with the range of different kinds of people in different kinds of situations. They need to be excellent communicators. They need to be really good advocates. They need to be diplomats. They need to have all of these essentially collaborative skills, but they also need to be individually motivated. They need to be self-starters, and they need to be able to get on with their projects often in the face of, there are independent curators in the room, so I'm telling you things you already know, but you need to be able to get on with your stuff sometimes when there's nobody helping you, and just in the hope and the expectation that support will materialise down the line. The skills that they're taught on the course, essential skills, curating, writing is very important, developing writing skills, developing an individual voice, being able to write in different modes, and commissioning. And these skills are delivered through a range of different courses. One of these courses is a course which I've been running for the last few years, which we call Curatorial Strategies. And it's basically a visiting lecturer course. So I describe the core course faculty, but another feature of this course is that we feel it's very important for the students to have access to as many different curatorial voices as possible. We try to make that as international as possible. Obviously, there are limitations around the budget, but we're in a lucky position being in London, in the people are often passing through, and we're able to take advantage of their presence in the city and invite them in to talk to the students about their own practices as curators. So every Monday afternoon we have a different visiting speaker they might be a practicing curator, they might be a theorist or an art historian who's looked at some aspects of curating, and they talk about their own individual curatorial strategy. And this continues throughout the first year, every Monday afternoon, in the first 2 terms. And in the third term, we sort of switch things over to the students and ask them to start making presentations about their own sort of aspirations in terms of curators. And these are the sessions which then lead into the development of the final exhibition, or a conversation about the development of the final exhibition, which they produce in their second year of study. So curatorial strategies, that's a course in the first year. There's also a course which we call Writing for Curators, and again this is delivered by a variety of core faculty and visiting people. The visiting people might be people who work in museums, curators of interpretation. Is this a designation that you have here? Basically the people who write the labels and produce the information for the public. And included in that is the idea of academic writing. So this sort of writing mode that one employs when one's writing a dissertation or a PhD doctoral thesis. So we're very clear that that's just one type of writing, and the mode in which you write a PhD thesis or a dissertation or an academic essay is not appropriate to address the general public. The general public respond to require a different mode of address and different kind of language. And so the curators of interpretation, for example, are people who might come in and do a workshop about writing labels, and the exercise would involve asking students to select a work of art and write a description of it, which would be addressed to the general public, but they would need to have a sense of who their general public was, because obviously the idea of general public is, not a fixed entity. It depends where you are, which institution you are in. We would also have art critics who would come in and do workshops on how to write art criticism for specialised art magazines or the cultural pages of newspapers. And actually, a number of our graduates end up becoming art critics. A number, not a huge number, because it's not a huge sector, but there are certainly a few people who've graduated from this course, and done that. Art in the Public Domain is a course which looks at commissioning for public spaces. There's a mistake in this presentation, I'm sorry. But we also do off-site visits. Critical Studies is a course which, it's basically a critical theory course, and it's designed around a series of kind of sort of key questions which relate to the core curriculum. So what is theory? What is a curator? What is knowledge? What is the public sphere? All of these notions which kind of underpin the curriculum, but which actually need unpacking, and that's done through text. So, for example, the session on what is public domain, the text for that might be a text by Habermas. But in each instance, the reading of the text and the discussion of the concept involves a discussion around situating that text. So, who was Habermas? What, how useful is his notion of the public domain, given that it was developed at a particular time in a particular place? How applicable is it to other contexts and so forth? So that's critical studies and different teaching formats, straightforward lectures. We don't have that many lectures, to be honest, because we're lucky to have small groups of students. So when we do lectures, they're often done in a relatively informal way. So there'll be a kind of presentation and then a discussion afterwards. Seminars, so these discussions around specific texts or around specific theoretical concepts are usually take the form of seminars with as much student involvement as possible. Quiz, where students present projects which they've been asked to develop and then get feedback from each other and from the staff. Off-site visits, we try to do as many of these as we can. Also just because everyone gets sick of being in the same room every day, because all the teaching is delivered in one place in the first year. And as I mentioned before, we have a lot of international students who arrive in London not being familiar with the cultural infrastructure. So we try to build in as many off-site visits and opportunities to go to galleries, see things, meet people, talk to practicing curators in situ about their work, studio visits with artists, all of those kinds of things are built into the curriculum as much as possible. And that sort of segues into field trips. And again, when the Arts Council funded us, we had more money for overseas travel than we do now, but we do include an international field trip in for every year. So if you go to the next slide, September was to be a sample biennial high. But when we do these field trips, we ask the students to prepare by researching what the content of the biennial, if it's biennial, will be. We build up a detailed itinerary, and we set up meetings for them with artists and studio visits. We set up meetings with local curators and museum directors and so forth. And the objective, obviously, is to help them try and contextualise what they're seeing as much as possible, insofar as it is possible to do these things on a relatively short trip. I think we were in Istanbul for 5 days, and we were lucky insofar as one of the students in that particular group is Turkish, she's from Istanbul, and so she was able to assist with showing us around the city and introducing us to people. So, and then there's a sort of feedback session about a few weeks after they returned from the trip. We asked them to make presentations to each other about what they've seen. And again, to continue the theme of the public domain, the theme of this year's Istanbul Biennial was the public domain, and so that was the theme through which we asked them to discuss what they'd seen in Istanbul. Can you go to the next slide? At the Royal College. The college is, I don't know if it's worth going into this in detail, but yeah, it's within the School of Humanities. The School of Humanities there are 3 other courses in the School of Humanities: the Critical Writing and Art Design, which is a new course focus on writing. It's sort of self-evident what it is. Critical and historical studies, which is a kind of theory of art and design course, and a course in history of design, or a program in history of design. We've always had close ties with the School of Fine Art. The college recently changed it or sort of reconfigured itself because it's grown in the last few years, and there's a second campus now, which is in Battersea, which is about a kind of 20-25 minute, it's more like a 20-minute bus ride away from Kensington, which is where the main campus is, where the curating course is based. The School of Fine Art used to be based in Kensington, and the advantage of that was that the curating students were in a kind of creative milieu all the time, so they had constant access to artists, people who were involved in making work. And since the School of Fine Art and its various component parts, the photography program, the painting program, illustration, etc., have moved, I feel it's quite a loss personally. And there was interestingly, there was a discussion at the time when the plans were being made about who should go to Battersea and who should stay in Kensington. There was a discussion about whether curating should actually become part of the School of Fine Art, and it was an interesting conversation, and it's an interesting thing to think about. Does curating belong with fine art, or does it belong with humanities, which are more kind of academic disciplines? And I don't know what you all think. But certainly one of the unique features of the course at the Royal College in particular is that it's situated within an art and design college. It's not like the Goldsmiths course, for example. Goldsmiths has a fine art course, but it's a university which teaches, delivers courses in social sciences, pedagogy, all kinds of things. It basically has a broad academic remit. It's not just focused on creative enterprises. These are some of the organisations who we have partnered with. On the right-hand side, these are all venues which were created through the lottery funding programme that I was talking about earlier on. The top one is a venue called Nottingham Contemporary in Nottingham, which is a city in the sort of to the north of England. Then there's the first site in Colchester. And to be honest, I don't know what the one at the bottom is, but this is just to give you an idea of the kind of shiny new landscape of contemporary art venues in the UK. So these are all organisations who we have partnered with in some sort of capacity. Some of them are based in London, some of them are based in the regions of the UK, some of them are European, and some of them are further afield. This is an illustration from the exhibition, students' final exhibition, which took place 2 years ago. 2010, I think, actually. So this was the graduating show. So the first year consisted of these talk courses, which I've described, as well as an interim project, so a small exhibition project at the end of the first year. In the second year, the split is basically 50-50 between collaborative work and individual work. So the collaborative component of the second year is working on a final exhibition, and the individual component is working on a dissertation of 10,000 words. So the remit for the final exhibition is that the students get to work with the galleries of the Royal College of Art in the main building in South Kensington. So it's a very sort of high visibility location, if you like. it's close to the Serpentine Gallery and the V&A, and it's in a part of London where there are a lot of other cultural institutions. So the Royal College of Music is there, the Science Museum, the Natural History Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is the National Museum of Design. So that's the sort of context in which this show happens. The galleries themselves were a part of this building, which was built in the 1960s. And in terms of their square meterage, I couldn't tell you precisely, but it's probably, I don't know, what would you say, it's about equivalent or slightly larger to the space here at the MCAD, but distributed
Both up and down.
differently, yeah. Was called Shadow Boxing, and it was, I think it was, the brief for making the exhibition to the students is completely open. So they're given a core budget. The core budget varies year on year, but it's usually in the region of about £25,000. And against that, they are expected to fundraise and also to get help in kind. The gallery spaces are given, kind of effectively given to them. The exhibition is on for about 3 weeks. The kind of gallery architecture is built by the workshop at the college, so there's no cost attached to that. And as I said, the remit is open, and in this particular year, so this was a group of students who joined the college in 2008. Sorry, I'm trying to get this right. They joined in 2008, so they graduated in 2010. What was happening in terms of the kind of political landscape at that point was that the situation with student fees in the UK was changing very significantly. So until relatively recently, higher education in the UK was free. In the 90s, it started, the Blair's government initiated a system where the students were required to pay minimal amount towards their fees, and over the last sort of 10, 15 years, this has incrementally increased to the point where now it's higher education has basically become a preserve of only the very well-off, or students are put in a situation where they have to incur really quite significant amounts of debts in order to be able to study. So the whole situation around the financing of higher education was very much under assault during the period that these students were studying, and there was an active kickback movement from students against this, and because the fees spiked up very high in 2008. And there were some demonstrations, student demonstrations in central London, some of which became really quite violent. And I don't know if this was covered in the news here. The most notorious moment was when Prince Charles, on the day of one of these demonstrations, this is in 2010, there was a demonstration in London, and Prince Charles decided that he wanted to go and have a look, and sort of wave to the students or something in support. I mean, this is what subsequently came out. So he asked his driver, who was driving this incredibly unwieldy, old-fashioned Rolls Royce with the royal crest on the front of it, to make a diversion from the normal route to where they were going to the theatre. He and Camilla were going to the theatre, to make a diversion so that he could sort of say hi to the students or something. Anyway, what happened was that the demonstrators, who were actually pretty angry, who'd been very provoked by the policing operation around this demonstration, realised who was in the car and tried to pull him out and tried to break the windows of the car, and it all turned quite nasty. And there were press photographers around who took pictures of this, and the next day it was in the press. So that's just a sort of extreme incident. I'm sorry, I have to drink some water. So just a minute. And it was in fact a work which they commissioned from a London-based Polish artist called Marysia Lewandowska. And what they asked, she does a lot of work with archives, and they commissioned her to do an investigation into the Royal College of Art's archive and look at the history of protest within the institution. And so the sort of yellow thing that you see on the wall behind is a kind of background to something that she constructed, which was a timeline tracing the history of student protest within the Royal College of Art based on material that she had found in the institution's archive. And this thing which says negotiation in the front was a relic, if you like, from the recent occupation by students of exactly that space. So what they were doing was using that space to refer to an event which had happened there, and also commissioning an artist to do add this sort of archival component. Can you go to the next slide? Back again, sorry. The slide's only slightly out of sequence. This is just going back, so that was one of the very recent iterations of the final exhibition. This is the first, or one of the first exhibitions, the first graduating year of CCA in 1994, and a very different kind of show. They chose to look at a thematic within contemporary art, which they identified in the work of contemporary artists. So it doesn't look terribly original now, but their argument in 1994 was that this was a new tendency, and in fact some of the artists who they included in this show have gone on to do very interesting things, or have, well, depending on how you look at it, or to have very visible careers. So this work on the right is a work by Matthew Barney, who at this time wasn't terribly well known, but then went on to become extremely famous and successful and wealthy. If you go to the next slide, this is an early work by the British artist and now film director Steve McQueen, whose most recent film, 12 Years a Slave, is a very low-tech video piece which he made called Bear, which is sort of, I think it's based around a kind of boxing scenario. From 2000, called Democracy. And this show was looking at, participatory practices by artists. So again, the idea of participation and what was subsequently theorised by the French critic Nicolas Boyar's relational aesthetics in art has become something which people, is something very current, or it became something very current through the 90s, but this is through the noughties rather, but this was from 2000. And if you go to the next slide, what they were doing was looking at as well as looking at contemporary manifestations of that tendency, they were also looking at its history. So this is, I believe this is a work by the New York-based collective Group Material, which is called AIDS Timeline. So Group Material were a collective who were sort of involved in activist through AIDS. And this was a show from 2001. So again, this is before the inception of the Frieze Art Fair. I think the first iteration of the Frieze Art Fair took place in 2003 or 2004. This particular cohort of students decided that they didn't want to do an exhibition, they wanted to have an art fair. because London didn't have a good art fair, and also because they had the belief that the most interesting work by artists could be seen in commercial context, not in public context. So they set up their exhibition basically using the structure of an art fair to invite artist-run spaces as well as kind of emergent commercial galleries from all over the world to exhibit called the Leisure Card Mogadishu. There was apparently, I mean, I wasn't around when this was happening, but there was apparently a bit of controversy around how the sales were managed and where the money should go. And obviously that was a bit complicated because the course was in receipt of public funding, the students were students, and it's still not clear to me what the financial arrangements were around those which were actually sold from this context, but I think generally speaking, most of the invited galleries were quite happy to have the opportunity to exhibit here. If you go to the next slide. I think that on the right, this is work which was exhibited by a space from Havana called Espacio Aglutinador, which is a kind of artist-run space with the commercial dimension. And again, these sort of incoherent gallery spaces lend themselves quite well to being a context for an art fair where things are usually kind of fairly chaotic and visually chaotic and disjointed, if you like. And there was a bookshop as part of this art fair as well. So they invited Waterkonig Books, who are, I think they're based in London and Frankfurt, specialists in artist books. They also publish, to have a concession within the gallery, which did quite well. And this is an idea which was taken up by subsequent groups of students. They quite often have a bookshop or a reading space in the gallery. Next slide. This is the instance in which the students decided to do a solo exhibition. So previously what had happened, people, outsiders had often observed that what was tending to happen with these final shows was that you'd have this group of 13, 14, 15 students, and they would end up curating a group exhibition which had about 13, 14, 15 artists in it, so a group of artists corresponding to the number of students. And the implication there was that each student needed to have their artist. He decided to do a solo exhibition of a London-based filmmaker stroke artist called John Smith. What we had done, is, the teaching with that group had involved a discussion around this idea of the problematic of the thematic exhibition. And I had quite early on started a conversation with them about the idea of the monographic artist show. And this was because when I had started working at the college, we had been reorganising the library. There's a little library which just belongs to the curating department. And the course administrator had suggested that the catalogues for the monographic exhibitions which I had organised didn't need to be in the library and that we should get rid of them. So she had obviously basically decided or somehow created, come to the belief that a curated exhibition was only ever a thematic exhibition and that it wasn't actually possible to curate a monographic artist show. And this was an issue which I personally I don't concur with that. I didn't subscribe to that at all. Solo artist shows, working with an artist on a solo show is very different from working on a thematic show, but that doesn't mean that it's not curated. It just means that the conversation with the artist is a very different kind of conversation, but there needs to be a conversation, there needs to be curatorial input. So we have been having that conversation and about what exactly the nature of that curatorial input was. in the instance of curating monographic exhibitions, and it was something that this particular group of students had started to become quite fascinated with. And then one day during the discussion, one of them said, wouldn't it be funny if we, a group of 14, decided to work only with one artist? And there was a sort of moment of silence, and then you could sort of see that everybody was thinking, actually, this wasn't completely ridiculous, it was actually a good idea, but the problem was going to be deciding which artist and finding an artist who would respond well to working with 40 curators, because it's a total sort of reversal of the more dynamic in the curatorial relationship. So the group then set about, I think, thinking about who that artist might be and showing each other works by different artists who they thought were interesting. And the way this was, I wasn't around for those conversations, and nor were any tutors, because these are conversations which happen between the students themselves. But their sort of epiphany in terms of identifying who this artist would be came when they saw this work by John Smith, which they all watched together. So I'm just going to show it to you because maybe you'll understand why they then decided they wanted to work with this artist.
Now, hold that trailer there. Trailer to the left, and I want the little girl to run across now. Hold that trailer there.
With John Smith, there are some installation shots of that show to follow.
Little girl to run across now. Hold that trailer there. Now move the trailer off. Right, now I want the old man with white hair and glasses across the road. Come on, quickly. Look this way. Now we'll go to the left. Okay, fine. Now let's have the man in the pink cap. Put the cigarette in your mouth. Good. And I want the two girls to come in from the right talking to each other. Now I want the Jamaican family. Father first. Look in front of you. Now mother and the two boys. And I want the smaller boy to point to the right and now cast the glance behind him. Fine, now I want the girl with the bag under her arm to walk to the right. Now let's have the man rubbing his eye. Good. Right, now I want everything to sink slowly down as the 5 boys come by. Hold it, and I want the clock to move gently towards me. Stop. Now, I want the long hand to move at the rate of 1 revolution every hour, and the short hand to move at the rate of 1 revolution every 12 hours. Now, 2 pigeons fly across, and everything comes up again until the girl chewing gum walks across from the left. Okay, now, the man, the woman and the boy, the man with the bag of chips, the car roof, the whole car, the old man, the car, than the lorry. Now, when the woman in the window looks in this direction, I want everything to move a bit further away. Right, let's have the man in the white boiler suit coming in from the right. Stop at the lamppost and fold your arms. Now, look around you. Walk back to the left again, and look left and right as you cross the road. Now, I want the man reading exchange of marks coming from the right. Now a man comes by and bites his nails. Two pigeons fly past from right to left. Two boys run past from left to right. The woman at the window looks this way and then goes on talking. In a second, I want four boys to come from the left, and I want one of them to look this way and flap his arms up and down. I'd like the boys to remain more or less in the same position, while everything else moves to the left and goes away a bit at the same time. Lift up your arm. Now bring it down. Now I want the man with the turban and briefcase to come in from the right. And now the man marks University of London, Study House, London WC1. In the cinema queue, I want to see a boy and his mother. The boy will be about 8 years old and his mother about 32. They'll both have collar-length hair, his dark and hers fair. She will be wearing a suede coat with a white imitation fur collar. They'll be talking to each other and looking around them. Now, I want the man coming in from the left with a great big cap to put on his glasses. The boy will look at his watch and yawn, then look at it again and say something to his mother about the time. Three children eating chips, the French woman, the window cleaner in his van, the greengrocer, the pigeon, the red Jaguar, the taxi, the man, the bag, the Negro with the briefcase and the newspaper, the woman firmly gripping the hands of her two young sons. They stop. And now they cross the road. The man in the great big cap takes off his glasses again and puts them in his breast pocket. The man with the walking stick is going home. The dentist continues on his way to the bank, and the two naughty boys appear from behind steels of plate glass manufacturers and cautiously cross the road. Steels is situated in an area with a high immigrant population, predominantly West Indians and Greeks. Outside the building, under the main doors, is a board advertising vacancies at the firm. Until recently, I thought the jobs were advertised on the board in two languages, English and Greek. However, a few weeks ago, I studied the board carefully and realised that I had been wrong. Each vacancy has its own slat in the board, and the words, glass cutters, bevelers, bench fitters, etc., are cut out of these slats, which are made of perspex. When a vacancy no longer exists, the slat advertising it, which has a sentiment at each end, is swiveled around. The words that I believed to be Greek were in fact upside down, back to front English. Steels also has another interesting feature. Along each wall of the building, there are 8 large doors that are kept wide open throughout the year. I'm shouting into a microphone on the edge of a field near Letchmore Heath, about 15 miles from the building you're looking at. I'm surrounded by electricity pylons and trees. The sky is beginning to cloud over. In the distance, I can see a middle-aged man in a brown duffel coat. He's got a dog with him, which looks like a Labrador, and I think he's got a helicopter in his pocket. In a tree about 20 yards away, I can see a large blackbird with a wingspan of about 9 feet. This young man has just robbed the local post office and is attempting to appear inconspicuous. He's trying to remain calm, but his hand is sweating as he grips the butt of the revolver in his raincoat pocket even harder. He's wondering whether the woman at the window would recognise him if she saw him again. The burglar alarm is still ringing.
Okay. I think that's the end. That was the work that they all saw together, and they decided that maybe it would be a good idea to do a solo exhibition of this artist. That piece was from 1976. And as it turned out, John Smith was a very good choice for this project. He's based in London. He had actually studied at the Royal College of Art himself. The students didn't know that when they saw this film. And he responded very well to the invitation. And the show worked extremely well, again, in these sort of complicated spaces. There was a variety of different kinds of moving image work. So this was a piece by John Smith, which was made between 1998 and 2011, called Hotel Diaries, which is about, it's ostensibly about various different conflicts taking place around the world during that time, and how he read them through the media. So he's watching TV in various different hotel rooms in different locations and talking about the coverage of different conflicts, and it's presented in this form of a series of monitors with headphones. Can you go to the next slide? And this was a piece from 2011 called Flag Mountain, which was filmed in mind going blank, jet lag. Is it Nicosia, the capital of Cyprus? The call to prayer. So it's filmed from the Greek side across the Green Line to the Turkish side, where there's this very sort of provocative, gigantic flag on the mountain, and the soundtrack is the Mezzuin from the mosque calling the call to prayer. Can you go to the next slide? And this was the girl chewing gum installed in the exhibition, and they decided to install it so that there was a view through to the street, so you would see the sort of contemporary world passing by in the distance. So that's a London bus going past, and the sound from the street, which penetrates into the galleries minimally, was sort of overlaid with the ambient sound of the street in Dalston in 1976. And again, this was a performance by Jarvis Cocker from the band Pulp originally, and someone called Thomas Truax, to a work by John Smith called Slow Glass. So the exhibitions always involve not just the mounting of the exhibition, the curation of the exhibition, but there's also the production of a publication, as I mentioned previously, and events programme to support the exhibition. And so this was just one of the events that they, about John Smith, and in conjunction with that, they also published a book looking at the model of the solo exhibition, and they interviewed various different artists about the solo exhibition format and what they thought about solo exhibitions themselves. So it was an exhibition accompanied by a piece of research kind of reflecting on what they'd actually done. A work by an artist called Eric Beltran from a show called Ritual Without Myth, which took place in 2012. Eric Beltran is Mexican. Next slide. Greek artist. Next slide. Work by the Brazilian artist Vija Clark. This was from shadowboxing, so it's in the wrong place. So shadowboxing was the show I mentioned earlier on, with the reference to the student demonstration. Both these were in shadowboxing. I'm sorry, I reorganised these and they seem to have gone back to their original positions. But this particular work was displayed opposite a window from which you can see through to the library, and it's a reconstruction of a short story by Borges, and each of the words is photocopied from a book which is in the college library, and so these numbers are the library reference numbers which relate to the shelf. They're the shelf marks for the books from which the words are taken. If you can follow that. Next slide, a Dutch artist, which was in shadowboxing. This is about rap artists in Rotterdam. The idea of resistance and how it plays through in their songwriting. And the next slide, sorry. This is also by Marita Lewandowska, so I mentioned her earlier on as the artist who had been commissioned to do research into the archive. And what she did with this piece was recreate an area in the college which is known as the Senior Common Room, which is basically the staff room, but it's because the college was created under a royal charter and has a number of, so we call them sort of pretensions around its identity. It has this area which is used for entertaining visitors, and is decorated with works from the college collection. So when students, painting students and fine art students graduate from the college, there's a condition that they have to donate one of their works to the college collection. They can choose the work, but that work then remains in the college collection. All of the work, so the Senior Common Room, which is on the top floor of the college, is decorated with works from the college collection. This work above the girl who's sitting there is actually by Ian Drury, who, I don't know if you know Ian Drury, the blockheads. Ian Drury studies at the RCA in painting, and that's one of his paintings. So there are some good works which are in the collection, but there are some real curiosities, and there's some kind of juvenilia by quite well-known artists. The abstract painting there is by someone called Victor Bergin, who is well known for a very different kind of photographic work. There are also pieces there by Tracy Emin and various other fairly well-known British artists, but none of them was immediately identifiable or associated with that particular artist's style. But what Marisha was doing with this piece was looking at the kind of institution of the Senior Common Room, the staff room, which was, and this is real furniture from the real Senior Common Room, and representing it in the gallery. And the work is called Subject to Change. So she was looking at the institution, looking at the features which made it distinct. One of which was this collection and this particular kind of staff entertainment and leisure area, and thinking about how current changes within education might affect the institution. So I think maybe I've been talking for really quite a long time. I think I'd like to perhaps leave it there. There are more slides of other projects which I could go to, but maybe people have questions or observations.
Theory courses. How important are the critical theory courses to the curatorial program? that the RCA has, and how it actually informs the second year formation of the exhibition and also the dissertation.
It's something which is one of the course elements which is dynamic. So when, again, I think when we were students, the critical theory course consisted of a strand on philosophy, a strand on post-colonial theory, and a what?
Cultural theory.
And cultural theory, yeah. I'd say it's important. I mean, its current iteration it's taken because one of the problems we have with an increasingly international student body is that we can't assume that everybody is arriving with the same kind of knowledge. It's also worth pointing out that students coming onto the course come from different kinds of, whatever their cultural background, they come from different educational backgrounds. So a number of them come from have studied fine art, quite a few of them have studied art history, but some of them come from areas which are completely kind of not obviously related to curating. So we've had students coming from law, who studied law. We currently have a student who studied economics. We also have people who study sort of tangentially related areas like architecture. And so I think one of the purposes of the critical theory course is to establish a sort of baseline of commonly understood concepts. That's how it is now, so that if we talk about the public domain, there is some kind of commonly held understanding across the group of students about what that means. Or if we talk about theory, even just the concept of theory, what is theory, what is a theorist? So I think the purpose of the critical element is, I guess, to sort of intellectually support, to be an intellectual support for what happens in the other elements of the course. Yeah. Does that work? Yeah.
Quick question. In terms of curating, is there a sort of standard, how do you say it, like a curatorial ethics between curator and artist for exhibition standards, something like that?
You mean is there a sort of code of practice?
Yes.
I mean, I would say that it's a good question. I think there should be. It's not constituted anywhere. I mean, curating isn't a profession, like medical practice. Obviously, as you know. But I think one of the things we try to teach and communicate to the students is that there are ethics to curatorial practice. One of the key issues is around how one works with artists, and what that relationship means, and the sort of, I guess the amount of power and agency, to put it crudely, that a curator can have when working with an artist. Artists often complain about curators, and I think that's because curators often behave very badly towards artists and don't consult them properly about how their work is shown, do things without their permission, misrepresent them basically. And so what we try and teach the students is what we consider to be best practice, which is that the lines of communication should be open, that the artist should always be consulted about how the work is shown, that no changes should be made to the work without the artist being involved in those decisions. that the artist should have the opportunity to prove, within reason, to prove interpretive material and text, things which are written and published by the curator about their work. I think that's really the core of it. Obviously, there are other issues, but none of these things are kind of written down in any one place. Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yes. Thank you. It's an eye-opener. Thanks.
What sort of relationship at the moment does RCA and other like-minded schools have insofar as curating contemporary arts with both from the idea standpoint and from the standpoint of the market, the art market? I mean, how does the curriculum of the RCA negotiate along those lines? Because it is true. I mean, there is the business, the market of art needs to be, problematized as well. So how does it? Because the slides that have been shown so far, I don't think they would sell. I mean, this works. How do these works actually sell? How do the artists actually live off making work like this? I mean, exactly where does contemporary curation put itself in reality such as what I'm talking about?
In the market reality, it's an issue for the cause, and that's why when at the beginning of the talk I was saying that the course was originally established with a very particular remit to train people to work in the public sector. So its remit, if you like, was doubly educational, that was educating curators to be curators, but the expectation was that those curators were working in public sector positions where, in the UK, certainly the conception of a public gallery is that it is educative. It's about educating the general public about contemporary culture or art. It's not about selling. Although all of us who work in this sector know that it's important for, there's a relationship there, and it's important for artists to have representation in non-commercial spheres for their work. I mean, certainly in Europe, I don't know, maybe in Asia the situation is different, but the public sector publicly funded museums and galleries legitimise the artist's work in a way that the commercial sector to date hasn't always done. So that an artist's work might be selling for lots and lots of money, but if the critical response turns sour or isn't suddenly, I mean, this happened to Damien Hirst, to give you a sort of well-known British example. He, at some point, the critical reception for his work took a turn for the worse, and that was because he had this exhibition in conjunction with the 2012 Olympics in London at Tate, which was very badly received, and as a consequence, his market value dropped. So, if one wants to look at unpick why that happened, you could argue that the problem lay not with the fact that he was overproducing and flooding the market with too much work, but because the way in which the Tate curated his exhibition didn't represent his work attractively enough or appropriately enough or critically enough, which was why the critical establishment turned on him, and the knock-on effect of that was that his stock fell. So that's one issue. There's a big question around, certainly a big discussion connected with this cause around whether a commercial gallery show, it's a discussion which goes wider than this course, but whether an exhibition in a commercial gallery can be curated at all, or whether to talk about commercial galleries as having curators is makes any sense. And some people would argue strongly that it doesn't, others would argue that it does. I think the whole notion of what a curator is and what they do is in flux all the time, and it's responding to other things in this, the scheme of representation. It's responding to the forces of global capitalism. It's responding to technological developments, all these kinds of things, and it's actually very, very complicated. Certainly there are students who come onto the course with the aspiration of, increasingly with the aspiration of working in the commercial sector. And increasingly that's where the career opportunities lie. Yeah, but it's, I think as teachers, it's harder for us to deal with that because once one's into that territory, you're dealing with individual tastes and the tastes of individual collectors and their wishes and so forth. So one of our external partners is an organisation called 176 Zabardovich Collection. So the Zabardoviches are private collectors in London who recently opened a foundation to kind of showcase their collection, and the ethics of how our students get involved with that collection and with those collectors have been complex, to put it mildly. Because the students are uneasy about the source of the Zabardovich fortune.
In the arts, you have the Arts Council, and us, we have next to nothing. So a lot of projects with contemporary art here are really coming from the private sector or from universities that we just very, very little support. So it's curious how, asking me what kind of relationship, because I think in more affluent countries they have, I think they have a quote unquote the luxury to stay, to keep their hands off money, so to speak, because they can. But in other contexts, it becomes quite tricky. Some curators will need to work with sometimes the private sector or in fact from the commercial galleries who, in fairness to them, I think they allow certain spaces for non-commercial work to be shown to the same public actually who consider work who are in the business of.
That's increasingly becoming eroded, for us. There's less and less public money for culture. Cultural institutions are increasingly under pressure to fundraise. I mean, there are people who would argue that the major arts venues in the UK have already basically been sold to corporations. And that the values which kind of dictate how things are done, how people work in these organisations, and also how the work is shown are essentially corporate values, and that's problematic. We're also, the RCA is also increasingly reliant on revenue in the form of student fees from students coming from overseas, and from the kinds of contexts which are closer to the sorts of situations that you're describing. So it's necessary for in terms of the training that's provided, it's necessary that all of that is addressed. And one of the things I initiated when I started the course was a project in conjunction with the Frieze Art Fair. So the students, the task of the students was to research an exhibition using the Frieze Art Fair as a research resource exclusively. And that was actually quite interesting because it was as a move within the curriculum, it was considered to be quite contentious by some of my colleagues, and they were kind of going, well, what do you can't get 7 students around an art fair. Art fairs aren't curated, they're just markets, and you can't see work in an art fair. It's impossible to look at things properly. And my response to that was, well, they need to develop strategies for looking at work in art fairs, because that's part of the, as you said, that's part of the reality that they will inhabit. We've got some slides there, but actually the responses to that brief were quite positive. But what's happened in recent years is that freeze art fair has become so expensive that we can't afford to pay for the students to even go and see it, because it's, it costs £50 to get in now, or something absolutely ridiculous. They have a team of untrained technicians in the form of the first year cohort who work with them on producing the exhibition, and that's part of the teaching strategy, and it's an opportunity for the first years to learn about, particularly about the architecture of that gallery space and how it works. So they get free labour, they get £25,000, they get the venue, the core cash that they're given is intended to be used as leverage for them to raise additional funds from trusts and foundations, commercial sponsors, private individuals, and so forth. So the net value of those exhibitions is way in excess of the £25,000 that they get given as their learning budget. Yeah.
The course says Curating Contemporary Art. Curating has a physical component to it, or a practical and physical component to it. Is the course in RCA, is this being taught? I mean, how is the instruction insofar as practical strategies towards physical curating is concerned? Is this built into the course, or is it something that students will have to find out for themselves as they are in the course already?
When you look at these slides that I showed you of all of these exhibitions, those exhibitions were designed by the students and installed by the students, with minimal help from. I mean, obviously we were working with them, and we were there to be referred to if they needed help or support or advice about things. But basically, the students did all of the work of conceptualising how this space would look, instructing the construction team about how to build it, painting the walls, doing the wiring. They did all of that. They do all of that themselves.
So set skills are also.
An exhibition coordinator or installer to work with them, but if not, you'll have to do it yourself. And the best way to know whether to manage somebody who's doing all of that is to know what it entails, to have done it. So to know how to mount a projector and to know how to move the film and all of those kinds of things. So so far as it's possible, we try to give them those skills. But again, they're the kinds of skills which, if you taught them all in a workshop or something, it would be, the information wouldn't be retained in the same way that it would if it was actually a real situation.
But you have placed.
We decided the transition between an institutional gallery like Hayward Gallery to become part of an academic institution. How did you decide on that process, and how is it different from each other?
I was basically sort of reaching a kind of burnout point in terms of working in an institution, and these sorts of the kinds of pressures that were coming, I think from funders, the kinds of things we were talking about earlier, the pressure to make exhibitions which would attract the public, to make a certain kind of exhibition in a certain way, and the sorts of pressures that was putting on me, and how that was playing through in my relationships with my collaborators, including the artists and other people involved in producing the exhibitions, was just kind of becoming a bit overwhelming. And I felt as though I hadn't had time to reflect at all on practice. And so stopping doing that for a while and teaching was a really excellent opportunity to reflect on the process of exhibition making. And in fact, it was a real revelation to me that from the point when I started studying curating myself in the sort of late 90s to the point when I started teaching it approximately 10 years later, a whole body of literature about the theory of curation had appeared, which hadn't been there previously. But I think it was really mainly just to have the opportunity to reflect on what I was doing. And I think it's important to have that, but I think it's also dangerous for teachers to stick in teaching positions and not to, I mean, I know in reality it's difficult, right, to do these things in conjunction with one another. You know, we have to earn money and we make compromises, but I think the ideal situation is where one is able to combine practice with teaching and periods of reflection.